Hi everyone, welcome back to another video and a new series. Today I'll start with the classical school of thought. While I'll cover the entire school from scratch, this series will require some prior knowledge of microeconomics and macroeconomics. It all started in the 1930s when John Maynard Keynes expressed his dissent for the classical theories in his General Theory of Employment, Interest Rate, and Money. But who were these so called classical economists? According to Keynes, they were the group of economists who came preceding his own theories. To understand the classicals, we need to go back into the time where mercantilists ruled the economic policy making. Mercantilists were those who wanted to increase wealth of a nation through promotion of exports and restrictions on imports. They emphasized on an active role of the government in the development of domestic industries. For this, they deemed it necessary for the country to have a balance of payment surplus. It was against these mercantilists that the classical economists like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, etc. emerged. These economists believed in the policy of laissez-faire, which essentially means that people be allowed to do what they want. As J.S. Mill stated, consumption never needs encouragement. Thus, the classical school of economics is essentially based on two tenets. First is that, according to them, money only acts as a means of exchange, and they emphasize on the role of real factors in economic growth as opposed to the monetary factors. Second, they stressed that the economy was self-adjusting in nature. This meant that, according to the classical economists, government should only intervene to ensure that the markets remained competitive. Now, according to the classicals, at equilibrium level of output, there is full employment. This happens when actual output is equal to the potential output. Actual output is the output that the economy ends up producing, while potential output is the output that the economy can produce given all the resources that are available at its disposal. Now that we've covered who the classical economists were, let's move on to the production and employment in classical theories. But first, it is important to know that the classical theories, since they emerged before the establishment of macroeconomics as a discipline, these theories use theories of microeconomics. Thus, when we look at the classical production function, it's a relationship between output and factors of production. Output Y is therefore a function of capital K and labor L. Thus, we can write Y is equal to F of K bar, comma L. We are taking K bar to say that the capital is constant. This is because we are assuming that it's a short run function. Now, the production function will be similar to what we have seen in microeconomics. The output first increases at an increasing rate, or the output may first increase at a constant rate. Then, as you increase the level of labor input, the output will increase, but now at a decreasing rate. After a certain period, the output will eventually start to fall as you apply more and more labor inputs. Thus, the slope of production function will give us the marginal productivity of labor. This is because the output is changing with respect to a change in labor inputs, as we have assumed labor to be the only variable input. So what we are going to do is we are going to differentiate our production function with respect to L. So we have dy by dl, which should be equal to df by dl, which would give us MPL, or the marginal productivity of labor. This would be an inverted U-shaped curve. As it initially increases, then it decreases, and then it becomes negative. For the classical school of thought, we will only be concerned with the falling part of the marginal productivity of labor curve. This is because it is at this part where the firms will be able to maximize their profits. We'll look more into it a bit further in the video. So what we have understood is that a firm uses labor to manipulate the output that it produces. So if he wants to produce X amount of output, he will hire labor up to a point that lets him produce X amount of output. Till what point will they demand labor? They will demand labor till the point that maximizes their profit. So now we know that a firm will hire labor up to a point that helps him to produce output that maximizes his profit. So labor demand by firm depends on the profit equation. What does this equation look like? Profit is the difference between total revenue that the firm earns minus the total costs that it incurs. So if we are assuming that W is equal to wages of the workers, R is equal to rent for the capital, total costs or TC should be equal to W into L plus R into K bar, where W into L is the cost of labor and R into K bar is the cost of capital. If the price level in the economy is P, total revenue or TR is equal to P into Y, that is price into output, which is equal to P into F of K bar comma L. Now that we know total revenue and total costs, profit or pi is equal to TR minus TC. So to maximize the profit, we are going to differentiate the profit equation with respect to labor or L, because that is a variable factor. So our equation will look something like this. d pi by dl is equal to dtr by dl minus dtc by dl. And this should be equal to 0 because that is the point of local maxima. This implies that P into df by dl minus W into dl by dl minus 0 should be equal to 0, which further implies that W by P is equal to MPL. Thus, firms will demand labor to the point where output from an additional unit of labor will be the real wages that the workers receive. So now that we've covered how firms demand labor, let's see what the labor demand curve looks like. Labor demand curve will be the downward sloping part of MPL. Why only the downward sloping part, you might ask? First, at the upward sloping part of MPL, output also increases at either increasing or constant rate. And here firm's profits increases. That is, a firm can gain from producing more output. Thus, it will keep on producing at that part. So, that would not be the optimal level. At the negative part of the marginal productivity of labor curve, the firms will be facing losses. So, the firm will never choose to produce at that part. This means that the labor demand curve will only be the downward sloping part of the MPL, which further implies that labor demand will be inversely related to the real wages. Labor demand or LD would be inversely related to Z of W by P. Now we shift to the labor supply. Individuals want to maximize their utility, and this utility depends on two things. First, the real income of the worker, and second, the leisure that they get. But there's a trade-off between these two things. This means that to get more income, the individual would have to give up leisure. A worker responds to changes in the real wages, and there are two effects that take place. First is the substitution effect, and second is the income effect. According to the substitution effect, if the real wages of the worker increase, it means that the worker will trade off leisure for consumption, which essentially translates into saying that the worker will work more and will consume less of leisure. On the other hand, if we look at the income effect, if the real wages of the worker increases, an income effect implies that the worker will consume more of both the goods, that is, he will consume more of both leisure and consumption, which essentially implies that he will work for lesser hours. It is observed that at low levels of real wages, substitution effect is usually greater than income effect. This means that the workers will trade leisure for income if real wages increase initially. What does this imply for our labor supply? It implies that labor supply curve will be a positive function of the real wages. Thus, if LS is our labor supply, it should be a positive function or G of W by P, where W by P is a real wage. So, if the x-axis represents the amount of labor supplied and the y-axis represents the real wages or W by P, our labor supply curve would be an upward sloping curve. So now we've looked at both the labor demand and labor supply. Equilibrium in labor market will be achieved when the amount of labor demanded is equal to the amount labor supplied. It is using this equilibrium level of labor will the firm produce equilibrium aggregate output. We can understand this with the help of a graph. It will be a two-part graph. The first part shows the labor market. Here, the x-axis represents the amount of labor. The y-axis represents the real wage or W by P. Labor demand is a downward sloping curve represented by LD. Labor supply is an upward sloping curve represented by LS. The intersection of LS and LD will give us the optimal amount of labor. Here, this amount is L naught. For output determination, we move on to the second graph. Here, x-axis is the same as the graph above, that is, it will be the amount of labor. Y-axis represents the output produced. So, it should be equal to y. We have a production function, y is equal to f of k bar and L. Extending L naught or the optimal amount of labor downwards would cut the production function at point we are assuming to be A. At A, this output is Y naught. This Y naught is the equilibrium level of output. Thus, we've looked at both the production and employment in classical economics. In the next video, I'll cover aggregate supply according to the classicals and start with the aggregate demand. If you have any questions, you can ask me in the comments and I'll try to answer. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.